Dr. Martha Joint Kumar, thank you so much. We're reflecting on the life of late President John F. Kennedy. Could you talk to me as we're standing in the White House briefing room, a place that he didn't know? He knew this is a swimming pool, but this is the White House briefing room, and he was the television president. Could you talk to me about his communication to the American people, particularly when it related to African Americans, blacks in this country?
Yes, he does become the first television president because by that time, by 1961, almost 90% of Americans had television. President Eisenhower had television, and he televised his press conferences, which had been off the record. But they weren't done live. They were played later in the evening. And Kennedy had live press conferences where he showed a sense of humor, a sense of leadership, of command, and they were almost performances that people enjoyed hearing him talk about policies or just a variety of things. Kennedy was a president of promise, and he had only his 3 years in office. And during that time, there were important changes that were taking place in what the public discussion was about. So you could say under Eisenhower, you had the beginnings of discussions of civil rights action. You had court action, and the president getting involved in it, and that was true under Kennedy as well, with the integration of the University of Mississippi, which took place in his presidency. And he was interested in civil rights legislation, but the legislation that ultimately was passed, which provided for public accommodations, for equality of access, public accommodations, that would be hotels, restaurants, all across the country, because they were involved in interstate commerce, the Congress could legislate on it. And that legislation really was the product of Lyndon Johnson and the work he did. What he decided to do was use the occasion of Kennedy's death to leverage important pieces of legislation, and in Kennedy's name to have civil rights legislation. So Kennedy is very important to the legislation, but he came a bit late to it. The Birmingham bombings were a very important point for him in pushing for civil rights legislation. He was interested in foreign affairs in Latin America, and he had a big push there with the Alianza para el Progreso, the Alliance for Progress, and then he also was involved in trying to deal with the Cold War, and met with Khrushchev. And then we remember him because of the Cuban Missile Crisis too, and in which the Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba. But that was a very tense time. And when he came in, he had a very young family, and that was quite different than his predecessors, Eisenhower and Truman. FDR had children, and younger children at the beginning of his administration, but not anywhere near as young as the Kennedy children, because the young son John was born between the election and the inauguration, so it was indeed a young family. And so there was a new spirit, and Jackie Kennedy, with her work restoring the White House, brought in something new as well.
So what's the takeaway 50 years ago in Dallas? What is the biggest takeaway that America should think about or remember with the death and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy?
the real sadness at his death. Having a person of such promise cut down in such a way was a great tragedy for the country. When you look at it, you don't know what would he have done with Vietnam, for example. Would he have put in more troops? Would he have put in combat troops? There's no answer to that. And I guess in looking at it, you just have to think that he did represent a transitional period between an older generation of people and a new younger one, even though he's a veteran of World War II. Gradually you have younger leadership ultimately comes up as you see now. But it was a time of promise, which was many things were carried out though, and they were carried out by his successor Lyndon Johnson. And so he was lucky to have as his vice president Lyndon Johnson, because many of the things that we think of as associated with Kennedy, like civil rights, actually are bills that were pushed by Lyndon Johnson.
And lastly, the communications that day. Since you study communications, what fascinates you about that day and how it was revealed when people did not necessarily know? Some people thought it was a backfire from a car versus a gunshot, and there was one person who really knew that was a gunshot.
It came across pretty quickly that that he had been shot and he had been mortally wounded. It came across fast, and it was a moment that took the attention of all of the country. And that weekend, people were absorbed by all of it and watched it on television. There hadn't been such a national moment on television.
Thank you so much for your time.